This is The Other Side with Damien Coury.
And g'day and welcome to episode 8 of The Other Side Australia. I'm Damien Coury and this is your weekly shortcut to Australia's best commentary. What a week! The sad tale of New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian. The World Health Organisation calls on governments to end lockdowns as a way of handling COVID. We've been saying it for weeks. And Dan Andrews and his CMO Sutton still steadfastly ignoring the advice, continuing with their massive economy and health-wrecking overreaction to COVID, passing the most draconian, liberty-destroying law I've ever seen in this country. We'll hear how citizens are fighting back against this state overreach and how you can help. American Conservative commentators react to the Australian 60 Minutes interview with Tara Reid, the woman accusing Joe Biden of rape.
He pushed me and up against the wall. He kind of moved his body towards me, and then he used his knee.
Don't be surprised that you haven't heard very much about it from the mainstream media. Alexandra Marshall will join us to explain how Silicon Valley social media companies are playing with their algorithms to help bring down Donald Trump. And we will speak to our North America commentator Ray Radowski for the latest on Trump's COVID resurrection, the US Supreme Court nomination, and much more. Let's go. In a time of hype and hysteria in the mainstream media, I like to go back to looking at the facts, the data. So, what is happening in the United Kingdom right now? As I record this, there's an uptick in COVID deaths in the country. From mid-August to mid-September, the number of deaths per day was averaging around 5 to 15. The numbers then started creeping up again slowly from late September until this week, when it hit the biggest number since July at 143 deaths in a day. Now, this is still well below the April peak, where there were a couple of days in the UK above 1,000 deaths. So they're a long way off that. Case numbers are a bit of a useless statistic. They aren't randomised enough, as statisticians would say. There are too many variables, like increased testing at different times and testing different types of people with different symptoms. All too many variables and too much inconsistency for the case number data to be meaningful over a long period of time. For example, when those peaks in April happened, 1,000 plus deaths, there were only 5,000 reported cases. The case numbers have spiked up to almost 23,000 2 weeks ago, so almost 5 times what it was back in April. But the death toll 2 weeks later is, as I said, in the 140 range, so 8 times fewer deaths than we were having back in April. So case numbers tell us a wave is happening, but nothing about the size of that wave or how lethal that wave might be. And mortality numbers, the death numbers, are also a bit shabby because of the did they die of COVID or with COVID question. In any case, there's an uptick, and Boris Johnson has decided to implement a 3-tiered system for lockdowns. But even the toughest tier comes nowhere near the lunacy of the Melbourne lockdown. The restrictions in the toughest tier for England, Tier 3, say you cannot meet in private gardens or pub gardens, but you are allowed to meet in parks, beaches, countryside or forests, so long as you're not in a group of more than 6. Pubs and bars will be closed, get this, unless they're serving substantial meals and only serving alcohol with meals. The Liverpool City region was the only area facing Tier 3 restrictions. The harshest bit of what most of the rest of the country is experiencing now under Tier 1 is that restaurants have to close at 10 p.m. Now, just compare that to Melbourne, which has, in comparison, almost no cases. At the time of recording this podcast in Melbourne, you're only allowed to leave your house for 4 main reasons: shopping for food and essential items, care and caregiving, daily exercise or recreation, and work. And employers have got to support you to work from home if you can work from home. Have we had enough of this madness yet, Australia? Are we ready to boot these Labor premiers out for good? And are we ready to demand that our federal government show some spine and leadership and exercise the power they do have to bring these premiers into line? You know, this may go down as a case study in mass hysteria that'll be referenced for years to come, particularly the ridiculous and likely illegal WA and Queensland border closures. No, they aren't keeping you safe. They have nothing to do with why you're safe. They're just ruining people's lives and seeing cancer patients suffering twice as much in their last days than they need to by being forced to quarantine after treatment interstate. The bureaucrats and politicians like Anastasia Palaszczuk and Stephen Miles, the union-controlled Queensland Health Minister, who put that Brisbane man into a hotel after his brain surgery, should not only be booted out of office for good on October 31 at the election, they should be sued or charged with criminal deprivation of liberty with the potential to cause death. After brain surgery, people need their loved ones around them for care as they recover. It's an awful recovery process. This poor man lost his balance and fell over in the dark on his first night in that hotel. It was only after massive public outcry that Palaszczuk allowed him to go home, as if she has the right not to. She even had to take 2 goes at fixing the problem with her dopey health department officials. After all this COVID drama is over, we need to get very serious about enshrining in law, or even in the Australian Constitution, something like they have in Japan, where the deprivation of liberty in peacetime is absolutely not allowed. That's why they haven't had any kind of heavy lockdowns in Japan, and one of the lowest rates of COVID in the world, I might add, even lower than ours on a per capita basis. Which brings me to what I think is the most astounding news of this week. Dr. David Nabarro from the World Health Organization appealed to world leaders, telling them to, quote, stop using lockdowns as your primary control method for the coronavirus. Yep, the WHO, the United Nations World Health Organization, says stop the lockdowns. Take a listen to Dr. Nabarro on Spectator TV.
We in the World Health Organization do not advocate lockdowns as a primary means of control of this virus. The only time we believe a lockdown is justified is to buy you time to reorganize, regroup, rebalance your resources, protect your health workers who are exhausted. But by and large, we'd rather not do it. Just look at what's happened to the tourism industry, for example, in the Caribbean or in the Pacific, because people aren't taking their holidays. Look what's happened to smallholder farmers all over the world because their markets have got dented. Look what's happening to poverty levels. It seems that we may well have a doubling of world poverty by next year. We may well have at least a doubling of child malnutrition because children are not getting meals at school and their parents in poor families are not able to afford it. This is a terrible, ghastly global catastrophe, actually. And so we really do appeal to all world leaders. Stop using lockdown as your primary control method. Develop better systems for doing it. Work together and learn from each other. But remember, lockdowns just have one consequence that you must never, ever belittle, and that is making poor people an awful lot poorer.
That's Dr. David Nabarro from the World Health Organization telling it like it is to Spectator TV. But isn't it funny how it's people who define themselves as being on the left who insist that lockdowns are necessary and that those of us advocating for them to end are the heartless ones? I think I maybe have one left-wing friend out of the 3 or 4 I have left who thinks that Dan Andrews has gone too far. As I said last week, that, in and of itself, is more terrifying than COVID-19. How easily brainwashed people are and how compliant they become and how easy they are to control. I'm sure Beijing is watching and rubbing their hands together with glee. Speaking of left-wing control freaks on a power trip, Dan Andrews is still there, I notice. And astoundingly, the most draconian piece of legislation I've ever seen in my life has become law, thanks to the Victorian State Parliament. You can't protest against the law because protests are banned, and you can't even suggest a protest because that'd be incitement to commit a crime. Apparently, maybe it's on very dodgy legal ground, that one. But many Victorians seem to be happy to take this lying down. Some, though, are not. Citizen journalist Avi Yemeni is helping 2 people get a lawsuit underway which will hopefully set some valuable precedents for the 22,000 plus people who've copped these outrageous fines of more than $1,600. No matter your position on COVID, there is no justification for fines at that level, and no justification for the draconian omnibus bill. So, if you'd like to contribute to the $60,000 budget for this important test case, being headed by constitutional barrister Kathleen Foley and criminal lawyer Madeline Smith, you can donate at savevictoria.com.au. That's SAVE victoria.com.au. There's heaps of information online at that website, including a video interview by Avi Yemeni with the lawyer Madeline Smith. Here's a little bit of that.
This is a case that has potential implications for all Australians, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum. You don't have to agree with Kerry or Tony to understand the importance of the argument that they're putting before the court.
What is this case actually about?
So the plaintiffs, Kerry and Tony, are seeking a declaration from the court that the stay-at-home directions that currently apply throughout Melbourne are unlawful to the extent that they place a blanket ban on leaving your home to engage in political communication.
So what would the practical implications of the outcome be here?
Well, at the moment, Victoria Police take the view that leaving your home for one of the 4 permitted activities is nonetheless an offence if you're also intending to express your political opinion whilst doing so. So the practical implication is that of a declaration is that people like Kerry and Tony who want to express in public their political opinion within the bounds of the law can do so without the threat and fear of police action.
Would this have any implication for non-Victorians, for people around the country?
Well, the case is, the argument is founded on the freedom of political communication, which is implied in the Australian Constitution, and that's a document that exists for the protection of all Australians.
This sounds really exciting, and I'm excited for a good fight, but are you really confident in this case?
Well, we think it's a strong case, and we think that the Constitution's on Kerry and Tony's side.
And that's lawyer Madeline Smith speaking with citizen journalist Avi Yemeni. And if you want to get onto that website, it is, once again, savevictoria.com.au. We said a few weeks ago on this podcast that there'd be a flurry of cases being brought to test all these nutty laws that our power-mad premiers have been playing with. Not only will the fines get thrown out, hopefully, as they should, but we'll also see massive payouts to affected businesses, probably. And guess who picks up the tab for that? Yeah, we do, the taxpayers. Good on you, premiers. Well, Sorrento hotelier Julian Gurner is one who's launched a challenge this week over the validity of the lockdown. And his case, we've just learned as this podcast is being recorded, that the case has been fast-tracked. There's going to be an urgent hearing Friday afternoon, I think around 3 p.m. Mr. Gurner owns Morgan's Restaurant and Bar in Sorrento in the Mornington Peninsula. He's engaged Brett Walker and Michael Wiles QC to represent him. In a statement that he provided to NCA Newswire, Mr. Gurner said the Victorian government's engaged in an unnecessary lockdown of the state and the economy, denying our basic freedoms as Australian citizens under our federal constitution, including our right to freedom of movement. This is not what we signed up for and is inconsistent with a free society, representative democratic government and civilised living, he said. Aggressive and heavy-handed enforcement of these restrictions had also alarmed most fair-minded people. Couldn't agree more, and we need to wish him the best of luck. By the way, Sky News anchor Peter Credlin has been rocking up to Dan Andrews' press conferences, doing the pathetically lame Victorian Press Gallery's job for them. She's forensically studied the flow of calls and text messages around the time of the decision to use security guards in the quarantine hotels. And everything points to Dan's office. That led to the resignation of his chief of staff this week. Too much on this week in the show to go into it more than that, but if you haven't seen Credlin's work, check out the Australian or Sky News. There are also free clips on YouTube. It's quite amazing work. This next story is unpleasant and a little bit graphic, so jump forward 5 minutes if you're sensitive or if the kids are around. But I think it's a necessary story to share. A week or so ago, 60 Minutes Australia had a piece on Tara Reid. Tara Reid is the woman who's accused Joe Biden of seriously sexually assaulting her when she was a young woman working in his office. There's actually two stories here. There's the story of the allegations against Biden themselves, and then there's the story of how this story is hardly a story in America. Conservative US commentator Mark Levin covered all of this on his TV show on the Blaze TV platform this week, and I want to share a little bit of that with you. Here's Mark Levin.
The New York Times did a story or so, and they basically raised doubt about her. Same with the rest of the left. It's amazing. The metoo movement is no movement at all. You don't hear a word from Hollywood. You don't hear a word from anybody. Other women have come forward, too, about Joe Biden. A Secret Service agent's wife, another woman came forward. Women came forward and talked about how he touched them inappropriately and put his face in their hair inappropriately. And when this comes up, it's either dismissed or ignored, or they bring up Donald Trump. Every situation involving Donald Trump has been analyzed. It's been reported. It's been discussed. It's been investigated. That's not an explanation or a defense for anything that Joe Biden has done over half a century in Washington, D.C. Well, Tara Reid was invited to speak on 60 Minutes. Not 60 Minutes in America, 60 Minutes in Australia. Now, last time I checked, Joe Biden's not running for president in Australia, but you got to give credit to the Australian media. They're really quite good, as opposed to the American media, which is clearly protecting Joe Biden. Let's take a look at what took place on 60 Minutes in Australia, because I guess this is going to be the only place in America that's going to take a very, very close look at it.
I worked my whole life to empower women. I've worked my whole life to prevent abuse.
You saw him up close as a politician.
Correct.
What kind of political operator is he?
The kind where he smiles, it's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. He would just put his hands on me. He would, whenever there was a meeting or if I would see him, usually he'd put his hand on his shoulder and then he'd run his fingers up underneath my hair, on my neck, and things like that. And I'd never experienced that with a boss.
Now, let's stop there. We've had many, many women come forward and say exactly the same thing now. And we've even seen many of these women on video.
And I didn't know him. It's not like there was like small talk, like where we would, you know what I'm saying? There was no reciprocal relationship or flirtation. There was nothing like that. So it was just very much him coming into a room, putting his hand on me or whatever.
Did you ever tell him, don't do that to me?
No, I was too scared to say that. I didn't say anything.
Did he touch other women?
Mm-hmm, yeah. He just didn't, he seemed to lack boundaries with women.
Some might try to pass the behaviour off as a sign of the times.
Reid was among several women who said Biden had touched them inappropriately.
It's now threatened to undermine his bid for the White House.
No, that ain't right, man. That ain't right.
But it's a pattern of behaviour that remains today.
Those Joe Biden shoulder massages, they're like magic. You should try one. Oh, you have.
Joe Biden recently vowed to be more mindful of personal space after 7 women came forward with claims of inappropriate touching.
I hear what they're saying. I understand it. And I'll be much more mindful. But I'll always believe governing, quite frankly, life for that matter, is about connecting.
You know, this is what's amazing. He's been told how to try and talk his way out of it. He's creating a different narrative about connecting, and he's a people person, and he's a toucher, and so forth and so on. Now, we've come across people like that, but you don't basically molest somebody. You don't fondle somebody. That's not a people person. That's a pervert. Go.
But what Tara Reid claims happened 27 years ago in an open corridor of the Senate is much worse.
So we were alone in this corridor and he said my name, and then the next thing I knew, he pushed me and up against the wall. He kind of moved his body towards me, and then he used his knee to separate my legs. He said, He said, I want to f you.
Jeez.
And he was whispering in my ear and he was kissing me and I was trying to get away from him. And then when I pulled away,
You right?
He had taken his hands and put them down my skirt and taken one hand and penetrated me with his fingers. And when I pulled away, he pulled back and he looked at me like kind of almost annoyed and he said, "Come on, man, I heard you liked me." And that's when I could see that he was angry and he put his finger kind of towards my face and he said, "You know, you're nothing to me. You're nothing."
Now let's just stop there. You have an individual who comes forward who's very credible, who's a Democrat, who's a liberal, who works for the senator. She has no axe to grind. She's not going to make any money. None of that going on. And her allegation is grotesque. He raped her. What she discussed there is rape. That's what it's called. It's assault, yes, but it's rape. Joe Biden has never been seriously questioned about this. He's had a few friendly reporters, but he hasn't been pressed hard. Even in the last debate, it didn't come up. Biden, who's being portrayed by the Victorian Guard, Democrat Party media, as a stand-up guy, as a family guy. He brings up his son, Beau, never brings up his son, Hunter. And it is shocking to me that we have to go to an Australian magazine program, 60 Minutes in Australia, not 60 Minutes in America, to get the facts, or at least to get the specifics. CNN has no interest in this. MSNBC has no interest. Quite frankly, I'm not aware of anybody has any interest in this.
That's American commentator Mark Levin on Life, Liberty and Levin, his program on the Blaze TV platform. Levin is one of my favourite conservative commentators because he's smart, and the show is a no-nonsense show. Blaze TV is accessible to Australians if you're looking for a good platform. It also carries the Dave Rubin Show and Stephen Crowder and many others. Credit also to 60 Minutes Australia, of course, for the excellent reporting that led to that piece.
The best way to get the podcast is to have it emailed to you. To get on our mailing list, simply drop us a line at theotherside@gmail.com. That's the other side, AUST, all one word, @gmail.com.
Joining us now is the queen of a libertarian and classical liberal and conservative Twitter in Australia, Alexandra Marshall, also writer for The Spectator and other publications. Alexandra, welcome once again.
Good afternoon, Curry. How are you?
I'm all right. A bit depressed. I think this is just like the worst week. And I woke up this morning and the omnibus bill is passed.
I was going to say, if you're okay, that's a lie, because it's not the case.
No, it's terrifying. And I was looking at The Spectator last night too, and it just talking about, I mean, everybody thinks, oh, they changed it, so it's okay now, you know. But The Spectator said that, of course, previously, and I'm reading from The Spectator, the public health emergency powers would have been extended to create authorised officers who are able to detain COVID-related high-risk people, high-risk in inverted commas, without any charge or trial. So basically just chuck someone in jail. Empowering public servants and classes of persons, which could potentially include union officials or ethnic community leaders, to be those authorised officers doing the detaining. Now, of course, that caused the big uproar that we reported on earlier.
Sorry, Curry. Are you talking about Nazi Germany or Victoria? Because you didn't call me for...
No, it's extraordinary.
You can't change the topic without notice like that on me.
Sorry, I sincerely apologise. Well, apparently the law was changed and everybody's cool with it now because there's been very little coverage this morning since it was passed, and we were recording this on Wednesday, so it was passed last night. But according to The Spectator, it says, Mr. Andrews backed down on the express detention powers, but the authorised officer provisions remain. An authorised officer, for all we know, if they simply don't like you or a social or political group you belong to, they can still declare you a danger to others who must be locked up, provided they can make a link to COVID-19.
Let me get this straight. We've got union officials, the CFW will be able to wander around saying that we don't like people and then detain them.
Potentially, yes. And
Wonderful.
it says,
that won't be abused at all.
No, and it's supposed to have been modified, but according to the Spectator, it says all they're apparently changing is that the people who are doing the detaining can't order the detaining themselves. They can still do the rest of it, but they'd have to call in, I don't know, maybe a police officer or something. But I'm just astounded by, and I've spoken to people, even friends of mine in Melbourne, who've said, look, you know, we are fed up with this. But there's just such a lack of outrage, Alexandra. Why do you think that is?
I'm not entirely sure that's true, because I was having a chat to some retailers in Melbourne and they are absolutely furious and all their friends are furious. So it may just be the media class that are okay with this kind of tyranny, but I don't think it's the general conversation down there in Melbourne.
I find that to me it's astounding because as you know, and I've said it on the podcast before, I moved back to Australia this year because of COVID. I've lived in Asia for 20 years, spent 16 years in Hong Kong, and I watched the first umbrella revolution, 2014. Million people hit the streets over a law that was nothing as draconian as this.
But that's because COVID is using personal fear in order for politicians to take power. And if you're frightened that you're going to die, then politicians are able to slide a lot more under the net than you would expect.
But it seems as if there is a bit of that, what people are referring to as Stockholm syndrome in Victoria.
Well, it's also Victoria. I mean, they keep electing a Labor government no matter what they do.
It's a very, very union-strong state too, isn't it? I mean, it's probably Australia's most socialist-leaning state. I have lived there a couple of times.
Melbourne's governed by the Greens, isn't it? I mean, that doesn't get any worse than that.
No, and since we're talking about the Greens, I just wanted to point to a new poll that came out in Queensland this week, a YouGov poll on the election that showed that the Greens' primary vote within the city of Brisbane area is 16%. 16%. That is 1 in 6 people in Brisbane put the Greens first. I mean, the number of people in the Greens who have business experience or some sort of managerial experience at a senior level, the kinds of people that they're putting up as candidates are not the sort of people you want running anything. We know that they are after the balance of power. They believe that the election's going to be close. If they've already got 1 seat in the electorate of Maiwar in Brisbane, which is interestingly in a very wealthy area, which is irritating because I think what's causing this high primary vote of the Greens is a lot of quite wealthy people that want to make themselves feel good by putting Green 1 and Liberal Party 2. And that's what caused the election of the Green member in this particular area. But there are other areas of Brisbane, like South Brisbane, where Jackie Trad's up for re-election, and you know, it looks as though the Greens going to get up there. But if we get 3 Greens in the state parliament, they could hold the balance of power, and that would be the end of the mining industry.
There is a special kind of irony that the Green-held seats and the highest Green voters are all inside concrete jungles at the centre of the city, whereas the farmers who are actually out looking after the bush and put their money into real environmentalism are voting for the Nationals and the Conservatives in One Nation. There's a very large discord there between reality and virtue signalling.
Now, you speak with authority on this because you're a farmer and you're out there in the country. So tell us, how you feel the mood is.
Well, we certainly get sick and tired of inner city Greens telling us how to look after trees and koalas from people who probably don't have a single tree under their possession in their entire lives. But what happens to us is we'll go to election polling booths and we'll stand there and we'll have people shouting at us, Greens for the trees, Greens for the koalas. And of course, they are not a party of environmentalism. They are a communist outfit using environmentalism to trick, basically, politically inept teenagers into voting for them.
Yep, the watermelons.
Also, let me give you an example of what they do. They come into our rainforest on my property and say, oh, that's a virgin rainforest, therefore we're going to take possession of it. Ignoring the fact that my grandfather actually planted the rainforest on previously cleared land. So we have nurtured the rainforest ourselves and kept the rainforest because we like it. And they want to come in and tell you how to look after trees on your own land that you already look after.
Just as they want to tell people how to do forest management for bushfire prevention.
Of course. And if we ever bring an injured animal to Wires or the Mid-North Coast version of it, they don't want to hear. They don't want to help the animal. They're like, oh, well, that's too hard. So farmers are frustrated. And they're frustrated with the Nationals as well because the Liberals are stopping the Nationals from being a true national party looking after the environment and rural landholders, because they're all so far left now with the inner city seats and voting that no one's getting anywhere with true environmentalism, which is concerned with the land, not with virtue signalling points.
And water management.
Oh, yeah, farming a dam. We're not allowed to build dams in case it upsets someone in an inner city seat.
People have just got to realise that the Greens, first of all, are not an environmental party. They're a far-left socialist party. They're more Extinction Rebellion than Greenpeace. So let's be really clear about that, for starters. I just say to people, if you are a Conservative or even, centre-right and you vote Liberal, do not put the Greens 1, Liberal 2, thinking that, you're doing something nice and your vote will actually wind up counting for the Liberal Party and that the Greens are an environmental party. They are not. You're voting for a party further left than the Labor Party if you vote Green.
If you want to know what a green environmental policy looks like, go and have a look at communist China, one of the highest polluting nations on the planet. That's what your Greens policy votes for.
Exactly. And if you are a left-leaning person, vote Labor, for God's sake. But put the Greens last where they belong. They're doing Labor no favours and they're not helping sensible centre-left politics in any way in Australia either. So, we've just got to get rid of this scourge altogether. And 16% is a frightening number. I mean, because what that reflects is a cultural shift in Australia.
But what's it going to do for people in Brisbane? If they vote Green, it's not going to help their tourist industry. It's not going to help the millions of people who are now being plunged into debt and poverty through no fault of their own. It's not going to solve any of their problems. It'll just send the state further and further into a welfare nightmare with no hope of escape. If they vote for the Greens, they're insane. Here's something fun for you. I was walking across the bridge at Pyrmont and I was behind a group of teenagers. They must have been about 18 or 19. And they're asking them, they're asking them how they were going to vote. They said, well, I am a conservative Green because I like the environment, but I believe in money. And all I could think was there's no such thing as an economic conservative Green. That's a fictional creation. So these kids are going to vote Greens knowing nothing about socialism or communism and nothing about the history of the world and what horror awaits them, simply because they think they're doing the right thing by the environment. And that is the fault of the Liberals and the Nats for not explaining that they are legitimate environmental parties and that there is more than one form of environmentalism. You don't have to belong to the United Nations Charter for how do we mix communism with environmentalism. You can be a genuine environmentalist, like most farmers are, looking after the land. Oh, this podcast we're listening to right now, if you listen carefully, kids, you will hear a million birds in the background of my feed because I am surrounded by life. It just won't leave me alone.
All right, Alexandra, thank you very, very much once again for your time. I want to ask you to stick around this week for a second segment because we're going to talk about some amazing new stuff that's happening with Twitter in relation to censorship. Coming up in just a sec.
This is The Other Side with Damien Curry, a new podcast for the quiet Australians. Tell your friends to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google, YouTube, and all major podcast platforms.
Twitter has launched a new civic integrity policy. Civic integrity policy. What is that all about? Joining us to talk about it right now is Alexandra Marshall. Alexandra, what is this civic integrity policy all about?
So once again, Twitter has outdone itself in rampant hypocrisy. Anyone who's on Twitter has noticed for the last couple of weeks that there have been a lot of strange things going on.
Yep.
And so it all made sense today when we found out that Twitter has been completely revising its algorithms in the lead up to the US election. What they're actually doing is they are censoring content that their fact checkers deem to be harmful, which is a bit like asking Stalin to pick and choose what kind of news is going to be released to the press. And if they don't like it, they hide the tweet or remove it entirely. So Trump's had a tweet this week about his own COVID health, which they hid. Once they hide a tweet, they make you click through to another page which gives you links to alternate information about what's contained in the tweet. You can't view it unless you expand it every time with a click, so it won't stay expanded. Accounts that are considered to be influential with over 100,000 users are being deliberately shadow banned and deboosted so that they cannot put forward content that can go viral. So they are absolutely destroying their own platform in order to control the conversation regarding the US election. Now, the funniest thing to come out of this is that there have been court cases against Twitter in the US, which is where their servers are,
Yep.
about whether or not they are a publisher or a platform. Now,
Yes.
this is publishing behavior in print outright. They are deciding what is and is not considered to be valid conversation on their platform.
Which means
Now,
they're
once
acting
they-
as editors and publishers.
They are
and
acting
that
as
has,
editors and publishers.
It's really important because that has particular legal implications, because at the moment, all these social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram operate under a special waiver that sort of says, well, you know, if you're not a publisher, you're just a platform, therefore we're not going to, you know, hold you accountable for things like libel and defamation, etc., as we would hold a publisher.
This is censorship and it is publishing. So if Trump continues to push through the courts with this, he will win now that it's in print, and that means that Twitter will have a choice: either become a publisher and become liable for all content, which of course it can't do, or they won't be able to continue acting like a publisher, and we may be seeing the end of online censorship, at least on Twitter, forever. This could be the beginning of the end of online censorship.
The answer to all of this, of course, is to get onto Parler, PARLER.com, which is the Twitter replacement, which has a much stronger commitment to free speech.
I am not giving up my spear, Curry. I am going to be here fighting the culture wars until the end.
You are, yeah, well, good for you. And you've got, 65 trillion followers, so I wouldn't move either if I were you. Alexandra Marshall, we are unfortunately out of time, but thank you very, very much once again for coming on the show and cheering me up a little bit.
It was a pleasure.
Ray Rudowski joins me next to talk about all the goings-on in the US in the past week. At the start of the week, it looked like the Victorian leader Dan Andrews was very much on the ropes. At the end of the week, it's the New South Wales leader Gladys Berejiklian facing the chopping block. And the premiers of Queensland, West Australia and Tassie continue their unjustifiable border closures as thousands of Australian citizens remain stranded inside and outside our country, and the feds don't seem to give a damn. Poor old Gladys. One premier who seems to be a good person with good intentions, who has some managerial capability. The premier who seems to have gotten the balance right between cautious, sensible management of COVID without destroying her state's economy in the process. We all need that kind of premier right now in New South Wales because the entire Australian economy is so dependent upon New South Wales. And the other state on which we're all dependent, our second biggest state, Victoria, is in the hands of what could only be described as the most liberty-depriving, controlling, business-slaughtering big government in our national history. But it's Thursday as we record this podcast, and I wonder if Gladys will last the week. So if you haven't been keeping up with the news, good for you. I'll give you a little summary. There's an ICAC, that's the New South Wales Anti-Corruption Watchdog inquiry, into the activities of a former New South Wales State Liberal MP called Darryl Maguire from Wagga Wagga. Maguire has admitted to the inquiry that he essentially turned his office into a kind of headquarters for his sideline business of selling access and visas to Chinese seeking immigration, property purchases, access to politicians and power brokers. Really dodgy brothers stuff. It's weird what drives people to do this sort of thing. It sounds like the money involved was hardly worth the risk. Anyway, the bombshell came on Monday when Gladys appeared before the inquiry and admitted something she says even her family and friends didn't know. That she had been in a 5-year relationship with this guy, which she broke off only fairly recently. And that is a problem. Because even though she claims she didn't know what he was up to, and he did fool a lot of other people, and maybe she didn't, she probably did. And probably for all sorts of personal reasons we're all familiar with in our own lives, she maybe tried to ignore it. It really is a sad tale, and while I think there's little that can save Gladys, and she probably must step aside, it's hard not to have some sympathy. Nikki Sava wrote a piece in Thursday's Australian, and I'll quote it. After Gladys Berejiklian's closest friends had picked themselves up off the floor, wiped away the dribble or the tears, rehinged their jaws and swapped bad taste jokes to relieve the tension as they literally spun out, they began trying to process what they just heard about her secret love. It wasn't just the what, it was the who. It was incomprehensible, it was shocking, it was inexplicable, injudicious, even reckless. It was so unlike the straight-laced workaholic woman they knew and so admired. Her closest political friends knew nothing of the 5-year-long relationship. She has sworn she didn't even tell her family. People who've known her for decades, who tried without success to play matchmaker, who lined her up with dates, who watched her at parties, nursing a glass of champagne for close to an hour before putting it down untouched, to whom she confessed what a lonely life it was, did not have a clue she was entangled with Maguire, nor were they aware of any other long-term relationship in all the years they'd known her. They cited her inexperience in matters of the heart to explain her behaviour, and you have to grow up the daughter of migrants in a strict environment to understand this. And that's the excellent writing of Nikki Sava in The Australian on Thursday. It is a really sad story, but I just can't see a way out for Gladys from this one. Well, there has been a lot going on in Australia and also a lot going on in America, and I hope we're going to be able to fit it all in with our North America expert, Ray Rudowski, joining us once again. Ray, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, and what a week it's been.
It certainly has. I want to start off with Trump's big rally, first one since he had coronavirus. Biden also had a rally that day. It was an in-car rally, and apparently only about 36 cars turned up. There were more Trump protesters at the Biden rally. What's going on with the Trump rally? He had a big audience.
Well, it's interesting that these rallies, I think, serve two purposes. Visually, they help energize his base, but the mainstream media seems to be turning them into a super spreader event. If you watch CNN, the way that they're covering it is, why are there so many people? Why is this such a dangerous event? Look at how close everybody is. You know, absent in that is the fact that there's zero enthusiasm for the Biden campaign. And around
so once again, the mainstream media not reporting the darn news, not letting the people speak that are the people in the news, the elected president and Joe Biden, instead running their commentary over the top of everything all the time. Let's let Trump speak. I want to play a little clip from the rally. He got very ideological at one point. Let's have a listen to this.
Joe Biden and the Democrat socialists will kill your jobs, dismantle your police departments, dissolve your borders, you know that, release criminal aliens, confiscate your guns, no more Second Amendment, get used to it, destroy your suburbs, and drive God from the public square. That's what's going to happen. You saw in the Pledge of Allegiance during the Democrat National Convention, they took the word God out twice. They said, oh, we made a mistake, excuse me, and then it happened a second time. We said, well, I guess that wasn't a mistake, right? The radical left is hell-bent on destroying everything we love and cherish. They're enraged and unhinged out of vengeance, and nobody can believe what they're doing and where they're going, but we understand it. We understand their cancel culture. We're not letting them cancel culture us at all. We're proud of our country and we're proud of our heritage. They want to punish the middle class, expunge every last trace of traditional values, and replace the American dream with a socialist nightmare, and that's what it is. They want to turn America into communist Cuba or socialist Venezuela and ruin the lives of Hispanic Americans and all Americans. And I want to thank the Hispanic Americans down in Florida. You have been so incredible to Trump.
That's Donald Trump speaking at his first rally since coming out of hospital and returning to work after his coronavirus.
Well, and this looks at, you know, what separates this campaign from other campaigns or other election years is it seems to be based around ideology instead of issues. The last time in 2016, the big issue was immigration, build the wall, that sort of idea. That's completely ignored in this situation. And now it's like socialism versus freedom or something like that.
Why do you think that's happened? Why has that shift occurred?
I think that there's not a whole lot of discussion about the issues because I think that Biden is not fully in control of the Democrat Party agenda. You've got these two competing groups. One is like a moderate face, but behind that is this apparent radical agenda. And I think that conflict has somehow put the Biden campaign in many ways on the back foot.
Okay, on the subject of the debates, the second debate did not happen. That was supposed to happen this week. That was because the university said that it wasn't safe to host the debate and declined to host it. Then the debate commission decided to turn it into a virtual debate. Trump said he was willing to do the debate in person, but he refused to do a debate hiding behind a computer, as he put it. Here's what Trump had to say to Fox News on that.
No, I'm not going to waste my time on a virtual debate. That's not what debating's all about. You sit behind a computer and do a debate. It's ridiculous. And then they cut you off whenever they want.
Donald Trump speaking to Fox News there, saying he's not going to do the second debate, but there will be a third debate happening next week and a couple of town halls separately later on this week. So there we have it. Ray, the other big news out of the United States this week has been the whole Supreme Court thing. The Senate confirmation hearings, they're called, of the Supreme Court candidate to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and that's Amy Coney Barrett, young, very conservative woman, not a Democrat's choice in any way, shape or form. And the Democrats turned out on the first day, just repeatedly in front of her, calling the actual hearing itself a sham and a charade. It isn't really a sham or a charade, is it, Ray? The president does have the right to appoint the Supreme Court justice and fill that vacancy, even though we're in an election mode.
Well, there's two things that are going on here. One, I think the Democrats realize that with the Senate in Republican control, that the appointment is going through. So they're using that platform as a way to attack the GOP, the Republicans, and Trump. So that's a great platform for them to say all these things and sort of scare those moderate voters into saying, hey, you know, whatever happens right now, we want to vote for the Democrats because I think that their agenda is going to prevent whatever it is that they're scaring us about. So that's the first thing. The second thing is she's unflappable. I mean, she comes off as almost saintly, like some of the nuns that that used to teach in some of the schools that I took classes in. It's very saintly, unflappable, and I think that dynamic, the Democrat senators that are grilling her don't want to push it too far because she comes off as being very likable and very much unflappable.
Very professional compared to them. I mean, she's just sitting there with a straight face behind a mask, of course, but you can tell from the expression on her eyes that she's very unimpressed with the shenanigans and the way that they're politicking and grandstanding and carrying on. And she just keeps driving that central message, which is exactly what you want from a Supreme Court justice, that, you know, the Supreme Court is not there to make the laws. The Supreme Court is there to simply determine whether or not the laws are constitutional or not. And that's her job. And in fact, it's the Democrats, if anything, that have historically wanted to, I think, influence the court more politically, or make the court more of a political activist entity.
The other thing is, from the ideological standpoint, you've got a situation here where your average moderate normal voter looks at this and kind of thinks, I don't really understand all this legal stuff. But the fact that one group wants to keep things the same, and it seems to be working, and another group won't say what they're going to do when they're elected, I don't know if I really like that, especially when the Supreme Court makes decisions that might impact my life.
Let's have a listen to Amy Coney Barrett herself schooling the Senate on the proper role of the Supreme Court.
Courts have a vital responsibility to the rule of law, which is critical to a free society. But courts are not designed to solve every problem or right every wrong in our public life. The policy decisions and value judgments of government must be made by the political branches, elected by and accountable to the people. The public should not expect courts to do so, and courts should not try.
That's Amy Coney Barrett, the Supreme Court candidate of President Trump. Ray, I want to just, before we finish up today, talk a little bit about vote rigging. There was an excellent little video put together by PragerU, and they had a commentator, an investigative reporter for the Government Accountability Institute, Eric Eggles. Eggles was talking about how the mail-in voting system could really be a recipe for some serious civil unrest after the election.
We already do that with absentee ballots, right? So why would universal mail-in balloting be any different? Well, the biggest difference is that with absentee ballots, the voter specifically asks for a ballot. With universal mail-in balloting, ballots are mailed out en masse. Millions of people who would normally go to the polls vote by mail instead. No national election has ever been conducted this way. And there are very good reasons to be concerned that one ever should. If we have a national election that relies heavily on mail-in voting, we're almost certain to see a significant delay before we get the final results. In a close contest involving massive mail-in voting, lawsuits disputing the results are inevitable. This could delay final results even longer. And instead of involving a single state, it's likely to involve multiple states. This is a recipe for civil unrest as frustration and fear of a stolen election grips voters.
So that's Eric Eggles, an investigative reporter for the Government Accountability Institute there, expressing concern about the mail-in ballots that have been mailed out in quite a large number of states in the US, something that Trump says will lead to a pretty chaotic result. Ray, what's your take? Are we going to see civil unrest after this election?
Let's talk about it from the perspective of media reporting of this. You've had a series of Democratic primaries using similar methods that were like shambolic. And the media really hasn't played it up as being significant. Even I think the Iowa primaries earlier this year, there was some sort of a mix-up or what they called a glitch that put the whole all the results into question. And those were Democratic elections. Now you're talking about a national election. And with the idea being that both camps, like the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign, are both creating this narrative, and the media is kind of complicit in some of this by suggesting Biden is 16 points ahead of Trump, which I don't think is true. But imagine that on election day, if Trump wins by a landslide, you've got this already built-in narrative of, oh, it must be voter fraud because the polls put Biden so far ahead. On the Trump side, they're pointing out already that you've got this bias in the way some of these institutions in the Postal Service, the Postal Union, they discovered a handful of military ballots belonging to Trump that were disposed of in some way. So both sides are gearing up for a bare-knuckled brawl of every ballot. What I think it means for the average voter is that their vote really does matter in this election. And I think more than anything, you're seeing a lot of these on-the-ground campaigns being decided, I think, ultimately by whether or not the campaign, meaning the Biden campaign or the Trump campaign, can register more voters. They get more voters, obviously they have the potential for more votes and less of a chance of getting into these contested ballot situations, which could tip the election in one way or the other.
Yeah. Just want to finish up just quickly talking about the polls. We're seeing a lot of polls saying that Biden is getting further and further ahead. I heard conservative commentator Mark Levin this week say that he believed that those polls were basically of registered voters and are not indicative of the new registrations, and that in the battleground states in particular, there's a heck of a lot of new registrations happening for the Republican Party, and the Republican Party's ahead on new registrations.
And then you see the daily Rasmussen tracking poll of approval rating, and that's been over 50%. So those two seem to be consistent. And you've got this poll that suggests that Biden is double digits when he hasn't been campaigning. And there hasn't been any big movement that would suggest that suddenly voters are shifting one way or the other. And then you've got this phenomenon of the idea that many Trump voters, when they're polled, are too embarrassed or ashamed or just don't want to tell somebody on the other end of a phone how they're going to vote.
You've just reminded me of this piece in the Spectator Australia this week. David Flint writes, he says, Gallup has been asking since the 1996 election this question: regardless of whom you support and trying to be as objective as possible, who do you think will win the election in November? And he said that in the last Gallup poll, 56% think Trump will win in a landslide. So maybe that's the indirect way that people are saying, hey, you know, what I'm hearing and what I'm probably going to do is vote for Trump.
The other thing you got to wonder is the polls, when they sway one way or the other towards any particular candidate, often discourage voters from turning out. So if you think, oh, okay, well, my guy's going to win by a landslide, my vote doesn't really matter, then that, or it could the other way. Oh, the other guy's going to win. What difference will my vote make in swaying the election because so-and-so is already going to win? I guess, there's a lot of, what we're looking at is unprecedented in the sense that the trust in the polls and trust in media is cast in doubt over this whole election.
As a result of 2016. Anyway, we're out of time. But Ray, thank you very, very much for chatting with us again. We look forward to catching up next week for more exciting discussions about the US political environment.
Yeah, we'll look forward to it.
And that is all we have time for this week. We're pushing that 1 hour mark again. We'll try and get it shorter next week, folks. We'll see you then. Take care. And if you like the show, don't forget to share, and subscribe.